You know, every single time you flush a toilet or even just wash your hands, you're kicking off this incredible, invisible process on a massive scale. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden world of wastewater treatment. We're talking about the trillions of tiny workers that, believe it or not, are responsible for cleaning our water. Okay, let's just dive right in.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? How do you manage a workforce of trillions that you can't even see? These workers are microorganisms, bacteria, protozoa, and they're the ones doing all the dirty work, literally eating the pollutants. But to get the job done right, you have to organize them. So how on earth do you do that?
So here's the game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to meet our microbial workforce. Then we'll look at the two big competing strategies for managing them, what I like to call the wild pool party versus the super organized apartment complex. After that, we'll put them head-to-head, see what they're good at, what they're not so good at, and finally, we'll figure out how engineers pick the perfect system for the job.
Okay, so here's the most important thing to get. The whole process, everything, hinges on keeping a really dense community of these helpful microbes. Engineers call it biomass, right where you need them. I mean, think of it as the total weight of all our tiny little workers. The problem is, you're constantly adding new water that's trying to wash them all away. And this leads to one fundamental choice.
Do you let your entire workforce just float around freely in the water? That's a method we call suspended growth. Or do you give them a permanent home to live on, a fixed surface? And that's called attached growth. Seriously, these two philosophies, they're the foundation for pretty much all biological wastewater treatment out there.
All right, let's kick things off with the first method, which happens to be the most common system in the entire world, activated sludge. We're calling this the pool party approach, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Everybody's just mixed together, floating freely in this giant tank, an aeration basin. It's constantly bubbling with pumped-in air, because, well, the microbes need to breathe to do their job.
Now, in this system, our little microbial workers don't just swim around by themselves. Nope. They form these sticky, floating communities called flocs. A floc is basically like a tiny floating all-you-can-eat buffet, where all sorts of different microbes team up to just devour any pollutants that happen to drift by. Kinda cool, right?
The whole process is this really simple, kinda elegant loop. First, you mix the wastewater in these flocs with tons of air. Then second, that whole mixture flows into a nice, quiet tank, a clarifier, where there's no mixing so those heavy flocs can settle down to the bottom. And third, and listen up, this is the most important part, you take a chunk of that settled microbridge sludge and you send it right back to the start. That stuff is called return activated sludge, or RAS, and it's what keeps the workforce super concentrated and makes the whole thing activated. Now look, the pool party is popular for a reason. It's super effective, it's pretty flexible. But yeah, it's got its downsides. For one, it takes up a lot of space. It can also be thrown way off by a sudden slug of toxic chemicals. And sometimes, for reasons that can drive operators crazy, the flocs just refuse to settle. That's a huge operational headache called sludge bulking.
So what's the alternative to this free-for-all pool party? Well, it's giving your workers a permanent address. This is the attached growth idea, what we're calling the apartment complex philosophy. Here, the microbes live on a fixed surface, and we just make the wastewater flow right past them.
So instead of flocs floating around, the workers here form a biofilm. You've definitely seen this before. It's that complex, slimy layer of microorganisms you might find on a rock in a stream. In these systems, engineers basically provide a massive amount of surface area, these are the apartment buildings, for this biofilm to grow all over.
A really classic example of this is something called a trickling filter. It's basically a giant bed of rocks or plastic media. You spray the wastewater over the top, it trickles down through all that media, and the biofilm that's living on all those surfaces just gets to work cleaning it up. Simple, but effective.
Okay, here's another really clever design. The rotating biological contactor. What you have here are these huge discs covered in biofilm, and they rotate really slowly. They dip down into the wastewater to feed, and then they lift up into the air to breathe. It's an incredibly efficient way to do things.
And now for a more modern spin on the same idea, moving bed biofilm reactors, or MBBRs. Instead of one giant structure, you fill a tank with thousands and thousands of these little plastic carriers. Each one is like a tiny floating apartment block. They provide this protected surface for biofilm to grow, and you could pack a massive population of workers into a really, really small space.
So, the huge advantage of giving your microbes a fixed home is resilience. These systems have a much smaller footprint, they're way more resistant to sudden shocks, and you don't have to worry nearly as much about getting that sludge to settle.
The main trade-off? Well, they can sometimes get clogged up, or maybe be a little less efficient if the wastewater is just extremely polluted.
All right, so we've met the two big competing philosophies. You've got the free-floating pool party of activated sludge on one side and the fixed-home apartment complex of biofilm systems on the other. Let's put them side by side and really see how they stack up.
We're going to break this down and look at 5 key features. These are the things that really define the difference between the two approaches, and they're exactly what engineers think about when they have to decide which one to build.
Now this slide, this really lays out all the trade-offs perfectly. Let's just walk through it. First, biomass location, floating versus attached. Pretty simple. Second, how you control the workforce. Activated sludge needs that constant management, that sludge return. Biofilm, on the other hand, is mostly self-regulating. When the film gets too thick, layers of it just naturally peel off. It's a process called sloughing. And just look at those last 3 rows. It's so clear. Biofilm systems take up less space, they're more resistant to shocks, and settling the sludge afterwards is just far, far less of a headache.
So, at the end of the day, it really boils down to this. Activated sludge gives you incredible contact efficiency. I mean, every single microbe is just surrounded by food, and it's very flexible to operate. But biofilm systems, they give you a much smaller footprint and way higher resilience. It's a classic engineering trade-off, right? Performance versus robustness.
So which one is actually better? Well, the answer, as it so often is in engineering, is that neither one is universally superior. The choice is all about using the right tool for the specific job you have in front of you. Think about it. An engineer designing a plant for some sprawling new suburb with tons of cheap, available land, they might go with a classic activated sludge system. But for upgrading a plant in a dense, crowded city where every square foot of land is priceless, a compact moving bed biofilm reactor might be the only option that even fits.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. As our cities get denser and denser, and the need to reuse and recycle every single drop of water becomes more and more urgent, will the space-saving resilience of the apartment complex model become the new standard? You know, the future of our cities might just depend on which home we choose for our tiniest and most important workers.